I never thought my own son would destroy me with a 3-minute video. I was arranging white roses in my mother's crystal vase when my neighbor Jasper knocked on my door that Tuesday morning in October. His face was pale, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by something I'd never seen before. Pity. "Eugenia," he said softly, "you need to see this." He held up his phone, and there was Bram, my only child, speaking to his 3 million followers about his toxic, narcissistic mother who destroyed his childhood. His words cut through me like winter wind off the Atlantic. 41 years of sacrifice, of protecting him, of building the life he claimed to hate. But what hurt most wasn't the lies. It was that he'd never asked for my side of the story. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I suppose I should start at the beginning, though beginnings are rarely as clear as we pretend they are when we're telling stories. My name is Eugenia Varelli, and I'm 69 years old. I live in a saltbox house on Elm Street in Ash Grove, Massachusetts, where the smell of low tide and Rosa rugosa mingles with the constant hum of tourists who come for our famous lighthouse and stay for our famous clam chowder. For 37 years, I taught art history at Ash Grove College, a small liberal arts school perched on the bluffs overlooking the harbor. I specialized in Renaissance portraiture, particularly the way artists revealed truth through the careful arrangement of symbolic objects. Ironic, considering how poorly I have managed the symbolic objects of my own life. The morning Jasper showed me Bram's video, I had been preparing for what I thought would be an ordinary day. I rise every morning at 6:30, make coffee in the French press Bram gave me for my 65th birthday, and spend an hour in my studio, the converted sunroom where I paint watercolors of the marsh behind my house. It's a routine I've cultivated since retiring 3 years ago, a gentle rhythm that keeps the loneliness at bay. But that Tuesday was different. The October light streaming through my studio windows seemed harsher somehow, illuminating dust motes that danced like accusations. In the air, I had been working on a painting of the old oak tree in my backyard, the one Bram used to climb as a child, when Jasper's knock interrupted my concentration. Jasper Northfield has been my neighbor for 8 years now. He's a retired musician who restores antique instruments in his garage, and our friendship began the way many do in small New England towns, over a property line dispute that turned into shared morning coffee. He's 62, never married, with wild gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. More importantly, he's one of the few people who knew Bram before he became Bram Varelli, life transformation coach. I wasn't sure if I should show you this, Jasper said as we sat in my kitchen, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. But I figured you'd rather hear it from a friend. The video was titled, "How My Narcissistic Mother Destroyed My Childhood," a warning to other kids. In it, Bram sat in his pristine Los Angeles apartment, the city skyline glittering behind him through floor-to-ceiling windows. He wore a carefully chosen outfit, a soft gray sweater that made his dark eyes look vulnerable, his hair styled just messy enough to seem authentic. "I've been getting a lot of messages from people asking about my family," he began, his voice carrying that practiced blend of confidence and pain that had made him famous. "And I've realized that part of my healing journey means being honest about the trauma that shaped me. Trauma." The word hit me like a physical blow. I watched my son, my beautiful, complicated son, describe a childhood I barely recognized. According to Bram, I was emotionally unavailable, manipulative, and controlling. I had, he claimed, used his father's abandonment as a weapon, constantly reminding him that he was all I had left, while simultaneously criticizing everything he did. "She never let me express emotions," he said, his voice breaking in exactly the right place. "If I cried, she'd tell me I was being dramatic. If I was angry, she'd say I was just like my father. I learned to shut down, to perform whatever version of myself would make her happy." The comments section was already flooded with responses. Heart emojis. "Thank you for sharing your truth." "Narcissistic mothers are the worst. You're so brave for speaking out." 3 million followers. 3 million people who now believed they knew who I was based on a 3-minute performance. But what devastated me most wasn't the lies, though they were breathtaking in their audacity. It was the photograph Bram had chosen to display while he spoke. It sat on his coffee table, visible in the frame. A picture of the two of us from his college graduation in 2003. In it, I'm smiling proudly, my arm around his shoulders, while he grins at the camera with the confidence of someone whose entire future stretches before him like an unwritten book. I remember that day vividly. I had driven down to Providence alone because Bram's father, my ex-husband Giancarlo, had promised to come and then disappeared, as he always did. I watched my son graduate summa cum laude with a degree in communications, knowing that I had worked double shifts at the college bookstore throughout his junior year to help pay his tuition. After the ceremony, we went to dinner at a little Italian place in Federal Hill, and Bram told me about his dreams of moving to California, of making something of himself in entertainment or media. "I want to help people," he had said over plates of vaso buco. "I want to use my voice to make a difference." I had been so proud, so hopeful. Now, 18 years later, that same photograph sat in his apartment, like evidence in a trial where I was the defendant, and he was both prosecutor and judge. After Jasper left, I sat alone in my kitchen and tried to process what I had seen. The rational part of my mind, the part trained in critical analysis and historical research, understood what had happened. Bram had built his online persona on vulnerability and transformation. His millions of followers loved him because he shared his pain, offered hope, and positioned himself as someone who had overcome difficult circumstances through determination and self-awareness. But the story required a villain, and I, it seemed, had been cast in that role. I walked through my house that afternoon as if seeing it for the first time. Every room held evidence of the life I had actually lived, not the one Bram had described. In the living room, the bookshelf still held his little league. Trophies next to my academic texts. The walls were covered with his childhood artwork. Paintings I had matted and framed as if they were masterpieces, because to me they were. In his old bedroom, which I had kept exactly as he left it, his high school debate team photo hung next to a certificate for academic excellence. The bed was still covered with the quilt my mother had made for his 16th birthday, a patchwork of blues and greens that took her 6 months to complete. These were not the artifacts of an emotionally abusive childhood. They were the remnants of a life lived in devotion to a child who had been the center of my universe since the moment he was born. But as I stood in that room, surrounded by the physical evidence of my love, I began to understand something that perhaps I should have seen years ago. Bram's success, his millions of followers, his book deals, his speaking engagements, depended on his story of overcoming adversity. And in that story, I was not a person with my own struggles and sacrifices. I was a plot device. The truth was more complicated than either his version or my wounded pride wanted to admit. Yes, I had been strict. Yes, I had sometimes been emotionally distant. Yes, there were times when my fear of losing him, my terror, that he would disappear the way his father had, made me controlling and anxious. But I had also been a single mother working 2 jobs to keep us afloat. I had been a woman trying to protect her child from truths that would have destroyed him. I had been someone doing her best in circumstances that felt impossible most days. As evening fell and the house grew dark around me, I made a decision that would change everything. I wouldn't respond with anger or hurt feelings. I wouldn't call Bram and demand an explanation or apology. Instead, I would do what I had trained myself to do for nearly 4 decades as an academic. I would research, analyze, and present the truth. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. I spent the next 3 hours on my laptop, diving deep into Bram's online presence for the first time. I had always known he was successful. The expensive gifts he sent for my birthday, the news articles that mentioned his speaking fees, the way strangers sometimes recognized our last name and asked if I was related to that motivational guy. But I had never fully grasped the scope of his influence. 3 million followers on TikTok, 2 million on Instagram, a YouTube channel with 800,000 subscribers, a best-selling book called Breaking the Cycle: How to Heal from Family Trauma, corporate speaking engagements that paid more than I had made in an entire year of teaching. And woven throughout all of it, like a thread in a tapestry, were references to his difficult childhood, his absent father, and his complicated relationship with his mother. The more I read, the more I realized that my son hadn't just shared a story about me on that Tuesday morning. He had been sharing stories about me for years, carefully crafting a narrative that positioned him as a survivor and me as the source of his pain. But there was something else, something that gnawed at me as I scrolled through years of posts and videos. In all of his content about healing from family trauma, about forgiving parents who had hurt you, about breaking cycles of dysfunction, there was one thing conspicuously absent: any mention of his own children. Bram had twin daughters, Mara and Anouk, who had just turned 7. I saw them twice a year when he brought them east for brief visits, and they were bright, curious children who called me Nonna and drew me pictures that I hung on my refrigerator. But in his online presence, they barely existed. Occasionally, there would be a carefully cropped photo showing small hands making crafts, or a story about a parenting revelation. But their faces, their names, their personalities were absent from his public persona. This struck me as odd for someone who claimed to be an expert on family dynamics and healing generational trauma. How could he speak so authoritatively about the lasting damage of parental mistakes while simultaneously keeping his own parenting almost completely private? As I finally closed my laptop near midnight, exhausted and overwhelmed, I realized that Bram's viral video wasn't just an attack on my character. It was a carefully calculated move in a game I hadn't even known we were playing. By publicly establishing me as the source of his trauma, he was inoculating himself against future criticism. If anyone ever questioned his parenting, his relationships, or his methods, he could point to his difficult childhood as both explanation and excuse. But what he hadn't counted on was the possibility that I might have something to say about it. Lay in bed that night, listening to the October wind rattle my windows, and thinking about truth. In my years of studying Renaissance art, I had learned that the most powerful portraits weren't necessarily the most flattering ones. They were the ones that revealed something essential about their subjects: a vulnerability, a strength, a contradiction that made them fully human. Bram's portrait of me was skillfully painted but ultimately false. It showed only the shadows, only the difficult moments, only the parts of our story that served his narrative. It was time, I decided, to paint a different kind of portrait, one that showed the whole truth, even the parts that might not reflect well on either of us. But first, I needed to understand exactly who my son had become and what he had at stake. Because if I was going to tell this story, I was going to tell it completely. The call came 3 days after the video went viral. 3 days during which my phone rang constantly, with calls from reporters, my email filled with messages from strangers, and my quiet life in Ash Grove became the center of a social media storm I barely understood. Mom. Bram's voice was different. Not the confident tone of his videos, but something smaller, more uncertain. We need to talk. I was standing in my kitchen, the same spot where I'd watched his video for the first time. The morning light streaming through my windows felt accusatory, highlighting the bags under my eyes and the tremor in my hands that had developed over the past few days. "Do we?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "Look, I know, you're upset about the video, but you have to understand I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was sharing my truth, my experience. That's what my audience expects from me. His truth. As if there were multiple versions of reality, each equally valid, each deserving of the same respect, regardless of their relationship to actual facts. Your truth," I repeated slowly. "Bram, you told 3 million people that I was emotionally abusive. You said I used your father's abandonment as a weapon. You called me a narcissist." There was a pause and I could hear traffic in the background. He was probably walking to one of his meetings, fitting this conversation into his schedule like any other business call. "I never said you were abusive. I said our relationship was complicated. I said I experienced emotional neglect. Those are very different things." The careful precision of his language struck me. This wasn't a son calling his mother to apologize for hurting her feelings. This was a public figure managing a potential crisis. "Bram," I said, sitting down heavily at my kitchen table. "Do you remember when you were 12 and you wanted to quit piano lessons?" "What does that have to do with anything? Do you remember what I said to you?" Another pause. "Mom, I don't have time for a trip down memory lane. I'm calling because my team thinks we should get ahead of this before it gets out of hand." His team, of course. I had forgotten that my son's personal life was now managed by a team of professionals whose job it was to protect his brand. "You wanted to quit because Tommy Martinez said piano was for girls," I continued, ignoring his attempt to redirect the conversation. "And I told you that you could quit if you wanted to, but that you'd been playing for 4 years and you were good at it, and maybe you should think about whether you were quitting because you'd lost interest or because you were afraid of what other people might think." "I remember," he said quietly. "And what did you decide?" "I kept playing." "For how long?" "Through high school." His voice was even quieter now. "And didn't you tell me, when you graduated, that learning to stick with something, even when it was difficult, was one of the most valuable lessons you'd ever learned? Didn't you say that piano taught you discipline and gave you confidence?" "Yes, but in your video, you said I never supported your interests. You said I criticized everything you did. But that's not true, is it? I supported you through 8 years of piano lessons, 4 years of debate team, 3 years of varsity tennis. I drove you to competitions, paid for private coaching, celebrated every small victory. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of 18 years' worth of carefully curated memories being challenged by inconvenient facts." "That's not how I experienced it," he said finally. "No, I suppose it isn't. Because you were a child and children see things differently than adults do. But Bram, you're not a child anymore. You're 41 years old with children of your own. Don't you think it's time to consider that your childhood perspective might not be the complete truth? I heard him take a deep breath, and for a moment, I thought we might actually have a real conversation, the kind we hadn't had in years, maybe decades. Look, Mom, I understand you're hurt, but this isn't about you. This is about my healing journey, my process of working through childhood trauma. My audience relates to my story because they've had similar experiences with their own parents. If I start walking back what I've said, it undermines everything I've built, everything he'd built. There it was, finally out in the open. This wasn't about truth or healing or helping people. This was about protecting a business model that depended on me remaining the villain in his origin story. So, I'm supposed to just accept being publicly humiliated because it's good for your brand? I asked. I'm not asking you to accept anything. I'm asking you to understand that this is bigger than just our family. I have a responsibility to my followers, to the people who trust me with their stories. If I start second-guessing myself, if I start changing my narrative, it hurts them too. The manipulation was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost missed it. But there it was. By defending myself, I would be hurting not just him, but all the innocent people who look to him for guidance. What about your responsibility to your mother? I asked. What about your responsibility to the truth? The truth is subjective, Mom. We both lived through the same events, but we experienced them differently. Neither of us is wrong. I had spent my entire career teaching students to analyze historical sources, to distinguish between facts and interpretation, to understand the difference between what happened and how people chose to remember what happened. The idea that truth was purely subjective was not just philosophically repugnant to me, it was dangerous. No, Bram. Facts are not subjective. I either worked 2 jobs to support us or I didn't. I either attended every school play and parent-teacher conference, or I didn't. I either sacrificed my career advancement to be present for your childhood, or I didn't. But how you were emotionally present, how I felt about our relationship, how your choices affected my psychological development, those things are subjective. He was right, of course, and that made it even more frustrating. A parent could do everything right on paper and still leave their child feeling unloved or misunderstood. But that wasn't what he had claimed in his video. He had made specific accusations about my behavior, my character, my motivations. Bram, I said, and something in my voice must have warned him, because the background noise on his end suddenly stopped. I need you to understand something. For 41 years, I have protected you from truths that would have hurt you. I have kept secrets that weren't mine to keep, because I thought it was better for you not to know them. But if you continue down this path, if you keep using our family as content for your business, I won't be able to protect you anymore. What are you talking about? I'm talking about your father. I'm talking about why he really left. I'm talking about the things I've never told you because I loved you too much to burden you with them. The silence that followed was different from the earlier pauses. This one was sharp, electric with sudden fear. You wouldn't, he said. I don't want to. God, Bram. I've spent decades hoping I'd never have to. But you've put me in an impossible position. You've made me the villain in a story that has nothing to do with who I actually am or what I actually did. And if the only way to defend myself is to tell the whole truth, then that's what I'll do. Mom, please, let's not do this. Let's just let it blow over. These things always blow over. But I could hear something new in his voice now. Not the practiced calm of a professional dealing with a crisis, but genuine panic. Because he knew, suddenly, that there were things I could say that would unravel more than just his narrative about our relationship. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, surprised by my own firmness. "You're going to publicly correct the record about me. You're going to tell your followers that you spoke in anger and that your characterization of me was unfair and incomplete. And you're going to do it sincerely, not as damage control. I can't do that. Then I'll do what I should have done years ago. I'll tell the truth about Giancarlo. I'll tell the truth about why he left and what I found out after he was gone. And then we'll see how your audience feels about your healing journey when they understand what you've been running from all these years." The conversation ended there. He hung up without saying goodbye, leaving me standing in my kitchen with my phone pressed to my ear and my heart hammering against my ribs. I had just threatened my own son. I had weaponized family secrets the same way he had accused me of doing when he was a child. The irony was not lost on me, and it made me feel sick. But I was also strangely calm. For the first time in 3 days, I felt like I had some control over what was happening to me. The truth about Giancarlo wasn't just embarrassing or complicated, it was devastating, and Bram knew it, even though he had never asked for the details. Some part of him had always suspected that his father's disappearance wasn't the noble pursuit of artistic freedom that he had imagined as a child. Some part of him knew that there were reasons I had never encouraged him to search for his father, never helped him maintain contact, never spoke about Giancarlo with anything other than careful neutrality. I walked upstairs to my bedroom and opened the closet door. On the top shelf, behind a stack of winter sweaters, was a shoebox I hadn't opened in 10 years. Inside were the documents I had hidden away after Giancarlo left, the private investigator's report, the photographs, the evidence of the life he had been living while he was married to me, the life that included another wife and 2 other children. I sat on my bed with the box in my lap and thought about the choice in front of me. I could protect Bram's secrets the way I always had, accept being publicly vilified, and hope that the story would eventually fade from public attention. Or I could defend myself by revealing truths that would destroy the idealized image of his father that had shaped his entire sense of self. It wasn't really a choice at all, because the truth was, I had been protecting Bram from these secrets for so long that I had forgotten I was also protecting myself from his anger, his blame, his accusation that I had driven his father away through my own inadequacies. But now, he had already blamed me for everything. He had already painted me as the source of his trauma, the reason for his struggles, the obstacle to his happiness. I had nothing left to lose by telling the truth. And maybe, just maybe, the truth would finally set us both free. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my living room with the shoebox contents spread across my coffee table, like evidence in a cold case finally being reopened. The private investigator's report was dated March 15th, 1993, 6 months after Giancarlo had walked out of our lives claiming he needed space to find himself as an artist. The photographs were still crisp despite their age. Giancarlo standing on the front steps of a colonial house in Hartford, Connecticut, his arm around a blonde woman I'd never seen before. The same woman pushing a stroller down a suburban sidewalk, while Giancarlo walked beside her, carrying a toddler on his shoulders, the 2 of them at what appeared to be a school play, sitting in an elementary school auditorium, watching a little girl perform on stage, the little girl who looked to be about 8 years old. The same age Bram had been when his father left us. Marcus Delacroix, the private investigator I'd hired, had been thorough. The woman's name was Linda Hoffman, and she'd been married to Giancarlo for 3 years before he married me. Their children, Sophia and Michael, were 12 and 10 respectively when these photos were taken, which meant Giancarlo had been living a double life for the entire duration of our marriage. The report contained other details that had haunted me for decades. Bank records showing Giancarlo had been supporting his Hartford family throughout our marriage, explaining why we'd always struggled financially, despite his freelance writing income. Hotel receipts showing his research trips had actually been visits to his other family. Even copies of birthday cards he'd signed "Love Daddy" for children who had never been mentioned to me or Bram. But the most devastating discovery was the final page of the report, a photocopy of a birth certificate for Michael Hoffman Varelli, born June 12, 1983, 3 months before Bram was born. Giancarlo hadn't just abandoned us. He had returned to a family that had existed before us, a family that had never stopped being his priority. I had burned the original investigator's report years ago, unable to bear having it in the house. But I'd kept these photocopies in case Bram ever demanded proof, ever accused me of lying about his father. I'd thought someday I might need to defend myself against his anger at not being allowed to maintain contact with Giancarlo. I'd never imagined I'd need to defend myself against accusations that I had driven his father away. The irony was bitter. In Bram's viral video, he'd claimed that I'd used his father's abandonment as emotional manipulation, constantly reminding him that he was all I had left. In reality, I had protected him from knowing that he had never been his father's priority, to begin with. At 6 in the morning, I made coffee and called Marcus Delacroix. He was retired now, living in Florida, but his number was still the same. His voice was raspier than I remembered, but he recognized mine immediately. "Eugenia Varelli," he said with something like warmth. "It's been a long time. How's the boy?" "That's actually why I'm calling. Marcus, do you remember the Varelli case from '93? Course I do. One of the messier ones. Your husband was quite the piece of work. Why? He surfaced again." "No, but his son, Bram. He's become something of a public figure, and he's been telling a version of our family story that doesn't quite match reality." I explained the situation briefly, trying to keep the emotion out of my voice. Marcus listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of understanding or disgust. "So you're thinking of going public with what we found?" he asked when I finished. "I don't know. Maybe. I just need to understand what the implications would be. Legal implications, I mean. Well, legally speaking, everything in that report was obtained through legitimate channels. If you wanted to share it, you'd be within your rights. But, Eugenia," he paused and I could hear him choosing his words carefully. "That boy of yours, he was just a kid when all this happened. Are you sure you want to be the one to tell him his father had another family? He's not a kid anymore, Marcus. He's 41 years old with children of his own, and he's built a career on claiming that I destroyed his childhood with my dysfunction. Maybe it's time he understood what I was actually protecting him from." After I hung up, I realized I was shaking, not from fear, but from something I hadn't felt in years. Righteous anger. For 3 decades, I had carried the burden of Giancarlo's secrets alone. I had let Bram idealize his absent father while accepting blame for the divorce. I had worked extra jobs to compensate for the money Giancarlo had been sending to his other family. I had crafted careful answers to Bram's questions about why his father had left, always emphasizing Giancarlo's artistic ambitions rather than his fundamental dishonesty. And now that same son was using my protection of him as evidence of my toxicity. Spent the morning researching social media platforms I'd never bothered to understand before. TikTok, Instagram, YouTube. the digital spaces where Bram had built his empire of influence. I created accounts, learned how to post videos, studied the language and conventions of online storytelling. If I was going to respond to my son's accusations, I was going to do it on his terms, in his medium. But first, I wanted to give him one more chance to correct the record himself. I texted him that afternoon. I'm giving you 48 hours to publicly apologize and correct your statements about me. After that, I'm telling my side of the story, including the parts about your father that you've never heard. His response came back within minutes. Mom, please don't do this. Can we meet in person? I can fly out this weekend. The offer surprised me. Bram rarely visited anymore, and when he did, it was usually brief, obligation-driven stops during his East Coast speaking tours. The fact that he was willing to drop everything and fly across the country suggested he understood the seriousness of my threat. But I was past the point of private negotiations. No. I typed back. This isn't something we can fix with a conversation. You made this public, so the response needs to be public too. My phone rang immediately. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again, and again. Finally, I turned it off and sat in the silence of my house, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of a life I had never expected to have to defend. That evening, Jasper knocked on my door with a bottle of wine and a concerned expression. You look like hell, he said with characteristic bluntness as I let him in. I feel like hell. We sat in my living room and I told him everything. About the phone call with Bram, about the private investigator's report, about my plan to respond publicly to my son's accusations. Jasper listened with the patient attention he usually reserved for tuning antique violins, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just bearing witness to my anger and pain. So what are you going to say? He asked when I finished. The truth, all of it. I'm going to tell people who Giancarlo really was, and what I actually sacrificed to raise Bram alone. I'm going to explain why I made the choices I made, and let them judge for themselves whether I was the monster he's painted me to be. Jasper was quiet for a long moment, swirling wine in his glass and staring out my window at the marsh beyond. You know, he said finally, there's something to be said for just living your truth quietly. Not everyone needs to understand your story for it to be valid. Maybe not. But when someone else is telling a false version of your story to millions of people, and that false version is being used to hurt you and help them profit, maybe quiet isn't an option anymore. And you're prepared for how this might change things with Bram? Because once you reveal those secrets, you can't take them back. I thought about that for a long time before answering. The truth was, I didn't know how Bram would react to learning about his father's other family. He might be devastated. He might blame me for not telling him sooner. He might deny it entirely. But our relationship was already broken. His viral video had made sure of that. And at least if I told the truth, it would be broken honestly, rather than built on the foundation of his profitable lies. Our relationship has been based on protecting him from difficult truths for his entire adult life, I said. Maybe it's time to see if we can build something based on actual honesty instead. That night, I drafted my first TikTok video. It took me 4 hours to write a 3-minute script, and another 2 hours to figure out how to record it properly. I'm not technologically sophisticated, and the learning curve was steep. But I was motivated by something more powerful than convenience, the need to reclaim my own story. My name is Eugenia Varelli, I began, sitting in my kitchen with the morning light streaming through the windows behind me. 3 days ago, my son posted a video about me that has been viewed by millions of people. In that video, He described me as a narcissistic, emotionally abusive mother who destroyed his childhood. I'm here to tell you a different story. Not because I need your sympathy or your validation, but because the truth matters, even when it's complicated and uncomfortable. I paused, looking directly into the camera lens that had taken me 20 minutes to position correctly, especially when it's complicated and uncomfortable. I posted my first video at 7 in the morning on Friday, exactly 48 hours after my ultimatum to Bram. By the time I finished my coffee, it had already been viewed 10,000 times. By noon, it had reached 500,000 views, and climbing. The comments were a mixture of support, skepticism, and vicious personal attacks. Finally, a mother fighting back. Competed with, "You're just trying to destroy your son's career," and much worse things that I won't repeat. But what struck me most was how many people seemed genuinely interested in hearing more of the story. Part 2, please, appeared dozens of times. Tell us about the father. We need receipts. This is better than any Netflix series. I hadn't expected to become entertainment, but I was learning that in the social media world Bram inhabited, everything, including family trauma, was content. My phone had been ringing constantly since I turned it back on that morning. Reporters, bloggers, podcasters, all wanting interviews. Bram's manager, Selene Rowe, had left 3 increasingly frantic voicemails demanding I call her immediately. Even Mara and Anouk's school had called, asking if arrangements needed to be made for increased privacy for the girls. But the call that surprised me came from someone I'd never heard of. Orla Dunn, host of a podcast called Mothers We Misread, Ms. Virelli. She said when I finally answered an unknown number. I know you're probably overwhelmed right now, but I'd love to talk with you about your story. I've been following the situation, and I think there's something important here that goes beyond just your family dynamics. I was intrigued, despite myself. What kind of something? The way we've created an economy around personal trauma. The way healing narratives get packaged and sold to audiences who mistake consumption for understanding. Your son's story is compelling, but it's also part of a larger trend of monetizing family dysfunction. I think your perspective could shed light on the cost of that monetization. Not just for the people being talked about, but for the people doing the talking. We arranged to meet that afternoon at a coffee shop in Ashgrove's small downtown. Orla turned out to be a woman in her early 40s with intelligent eyes and an immediately trustworthy manner. She'd been an investigative journalist before transitioning to podcasting, and her show focused on re-examining famous or viral stories about difficult mothers from the mothers' perspectives. I started the podcast after my own mother died, she explained over lattes that cost more than my entire lunch budget in the 1990s. She'd been estranged from my sister for years over something that seemed huge at the time, but turned out to be a misunderstanding. After the funeral, my sister found Mom's journals and realized she'd been wrong about almost everything. But it was too late to apologize or repair the relationship. I started wondering how many other mothers had been misunderstood, mischaracterized, or simply never given the chance to tell their side. I found myself telling Orla things I hadn't planned to share with anyone. About the years of working 2 jobs while Bram was in school. About the nights I'd stayed up helping him with projects, or driving him to early morning practices. About the sacrifices I'd made to his career advancement so I could be present for his childhood. But also about my mistakes. The times I'd been too tired to be patient. The ways my own fears about abandonment had made me overprotective. The emotional distance I'd maintained to protect both of us from the pain of Giancarlo's betrayal. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so If you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The thing is, I said as we neared the end of our conversation, I'm not claiming I was a perfect mother. I made mistakes, some of them significant ones. But the version of me that Bram presented to his audience isn't just imperfect. It's fundamentally dishonest, and it's being used to sell a product. Tell me about the product, Orla said. Hope, I suppose. The idea that you can heal from family trauma by identifying the source of your pain and then learning to forgive or move beyond it. Bram's story is powerful because it offers his audience a path forward. If he can overcome his toxic mother and absent father, they can overcome their difficult families too. But your side of the story complicates that narrative. My side of the story suggests that family relationships are complex, that good people can hurt each other without meaning to, and that sometimes the healing process requires multiple perspectives rather than just one person's truth. Orla leaned forward, her recorder still running between us. What would you want people to understand about your relationship with your son? I thought about that for a long time before answering. I'd want them to understand that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to. That protecting someone sometimes means making choices that seem cold or distant from the outside. That the mother who sets boundaries or says no or refuses to enable might actually be the one who loves you most. And what would you want Bram to understand? That was harder to answer, because it required acknowledging how much our relationship had deteriorated over the years, not just since his viral video, but gradually, as his success had grown and his need for me had diminished. I'd want him to understand that I kept his father's secrets not to manipulate him, but to protect him. That every choice I made was about trying to give him the best possible chance at a happy, stable life. And that when he tells his story as if I was the villain, he's not just hurting me. He's rewriting history in a way that erases his own agency and growth. The interview lasted 3 hours. When it was over, Orla asked if she could contact me, again after she'd had time to research Bram's claims and my responses more thoroughly. This is going to be bigger than just one podcast episode, she said as we stood to leave. I think you've opened up a conversation that needs to happen about the ethics of public storytelling and the responsibility we have to the people in our stories. I drove home feeling simultaneously drained and energized. Talking to Orla had helped me clarify my own thoughts about what I was trying to accomplish. This wasn't just about defending myself against Bram's accusations. It was about challenging the entire framework that made those accusations profitable. But when I pulled into my driveway, I saw a familiar figure sitting on my front steps, Selene Rowe, Bram's manager, looking like she'd been waiting for hours. Selene was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with platinum blonde hair and the kind of sharp, expensive clothing that suggested success in whatever industry shaped people like Bram. She stood as I approached, extending a manicured hand and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Ms. Varelli, I'm Selene Rowe. I think we need to talk. I invited her in, curious despite myself about what Bram's team thought they could accomplish with an in-person visit. I'll be direct, she said once we were seated in my living room. Your video has created a problem for us. Bram's brand is built on authenticity and vulnerability. When family members contradict his narrative, it raises questions about his credibility that we can't afford. Maybe you should have thought about that before he decided to make me part of his narrative without my consent, I replied. Look, I understand you're hurt, but Bram was sharing his truth, his lived experience. That's what his audience connects with. That's what they trust him for. And what about my lived experience? What about my truth? Selene shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to having her client's decisions challenged. "Here's what I can offer," she said, pulling out her phone. "We delete the original video. Bram posts a clarification saying he spoke in anger and that family relationships are complicated. We frame it as him growing and learning, which actually strengthens his brand as someone who's committed to self-improvement. In exchange for what? You stop posting videos. You decline all interview requests. You let this story fade away." I almost laughed. The audacity was breathtaking. They wanted to control not just Bram's narrative, but mine as well. "No," I said simply. "Ms. Varelli, I don't think you understand what you're getting into. Social media can be a very ugly place. The attention you're getting now might seem positive, but it can turn very quickly. People will dig into your life, your past, your mistakes. They'll find things you thought were private and make them public. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. If I continued to challenge Bram's story, his team would ensure that my own secrets and mistakes became public knowledge. But what Selene didn't understand was that I had already decided to make my secrets public myself. "Actually," I said, reaching for the manila folder I'd left on my coffee table, "I'm planning to save everyone the trouble." I opened the folder and spread out copies of the private investigator's photographs. Selene's expression changed as she realized what she was looking. These are photos of Bram's father with his other family," I said conversationally. "The family he was supporting throughout our marriage. The children he was raising while claiming he needed to leave us to pursue his art." Selene's face went pale. "Where did you get these?" "I hired a private investigator in 1993. Turns out Giancarlo had been living a double life for years. Bram has spent his entire adult life believing his father left because I was too demanding, too controlling, too emotionally suffocating. But the truth is, his father left because his other wife found out about us and gave him an ultimatum." "You can't be planning to release this," Selene said, her voice tight with panic. "It would destroy him. It would destroy the mythology he's built around his childhood trauma. But maybe that mythology was never serving him anyway." I could see Selene calculating, trying to figure out how to manage this new threat to her client's brand. "What do you want?" she asked finally. "I want Bram to tell the truth. I want him to acknowledge that his characterization of me was unfair and incomplete. I want him to stop using our family dysfunction as content for his business. And I want him to start being honest with his audience about the complexity of family relationships instead of selling them simple stories about good guys and bad guys. That's impossible. His entire platform is built on overcoming family trauma. If he admits he was wrong about you, it undermines everything he's worked for. Then maybe everything he's worked for was built on a lie." Selene left shortly after that, muttering about damage control and legal options. But I could see in her eyes that she understood the impossible position Bram had put himself in. He had built his success on a story that required me to remain silent, and I was no longer willing to do that. That evening, I posted my second video. In it, I talked about the private investigator's report and what I discovered about Giancarlo's other family. I didn't show the photographs. I wasn't ready to be that cruel. But I explained why I had hidden the truth from Bram and how his idealization of his father had shaped his resentment toward me. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, Giancarlo Virelli was trending, with people trying to find more information about Bram's father. Someone had already tracked down Linda Hoffman's social media accounts. The story was spiraling beyond my control, becoming exactly the kind of public spectacle I had hoped to avoid. But it was too late to stop now. The truth was out, incomplete and messy as it was. All that remained was to see what Bram would do with it. The morning after my second video went viral, I woke to find 3 news vans parked outside my house and a reporter doing a live broadcast from my front yard. I watched from my bedroom window as she gestured toward my home, no doubt explaining to her audience how this quiet saltbox house had become the epicenter of a social media storm about family trauma and truth-telling. My phone showed 47, missed calls and hundreds of text messages. I scrolled through them while my coffee brewed, noting the mixture of support, condemnation, and outright threats. But one message stopped me cold. "Mom, please call me. We need to talk before this gets any worse. Before this gets any worse." As if the revelation that his father had betrayed our entire family was just an inconvenience to be managed rather than a fundamental truth that changed everything he thought he knew about his childhood. But I called him anyway. "Jesus Christ. Mom," were his first words. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I was sitting in my kitchen, the same place where this had all started a week ago, watching reporters mill around my front yard like scavengers. "I told the truth," I said. "Something I should have done 30 years ago." "You destroyed my credibility. My entire brand is built on overcoming abandonment trauma. And now you're telling the world that my father didn't actually abandon us. He went back to his real family?" "He did abandon us, Bram. The fact that he had somewhere to go doesn't make the abandonment less real. But it changes everything. Don't you understand? My audience trusted me because they related to my story of being left behind, of feeling unwanted. Now they're going to think I was lying about everything." I could hear voices in the background. His team, probably, trying to figure out how to spin this latest development. "Maybe they should think that?" I said quietly. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" "Maybe you were lying about everything. Not intentionally, but because you built your story on incomplete information and then refused to question it even when you were old enough to know better." The silence that followed was charged with 30 years of unspoken resentments. "You know what, Mom? You're right. I was lying. Because the truth is so much worse than what I told them." Something in his voice made my stomach clench. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that you didn't just hide Dad's other family from me. You hid everything about him. His drinking, his violence, his psychiatric history. You want to talk about truth? Let's talk about the whole truth." I felt the world tilt around me. "Bram, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly. I hired my own investigator last year, Mom. After I started therapy to deal with my childhood trauma, I wanted to find Dad, maybe reconnect with him. Do you want to know what I found out?" I couldn't speak. This was the moment I had been dreading for 3 decades, the reason I had kept so many secrets for so long. I found out he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in 1987. I found out he was hospitalized twice during their marriage for psychotic episodes. I found out he hit you, Mom. Multiple times. I found the police reports. The coffee mug slipped from my hands, shattering on the kitchen floor in a cascade of ceramic and dark liquid. I stared at the mess, remembering other messes I'd cleaned up in this same kitchen. Blood from split lips, broken dishes from thrown tantrums, the detritus of a marriage that had been disintegrating long before Giancarlo walked out the door. "Why didn't you tell me?" Bram's voice was quieter now, almost broken. "Because you were 8 years old. I whispered, because I wanted you to be able to love your father without being afraid of him. Because I thought it would be easier for you to believe he left for noble reasons rather than because he was sick. But I grew up, Mom. I became an adult. At some point, you could have told me the truth. He was right, of course. There had been opportunities over the years to fill in the gaps in his understanding. But each time the moment had presented itself, I had chosen protection over honesty, shielding over transparency. I was afraid, I admitted. I was afraid you'd blame yourself for his illness. I was afraid you'd worry about inheriting it. I was afraid you'd understand why I sometimes seemed distant or overprotective. So instead you let me blame you for everything. Yes, the admission hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure either of us was ready to cross. Mom, Bram said finally, I need you to stop posting videos. Just for a few days while I figure out how to handle this. Handle this how? I don't know yet. Maybe I tell the whole story. About Dad's illness, about the violence, about why you really kept us apart from him. Maybe I reframe my narrative around growing up with a mother who was protecting me from things I didn't understand. And what? About your brand? Your credibility? I'll figure it out. But right now, every video you post makes this more complicated. Please, just give me some time to process this and decide how to move forward. I agreed, though part of me wondered if this was just another attempt to control the narrative. But Bram sounded genuinely shaken, and I realized that my revelations had forced him to confront not just the lies he'd told his audience, but the lies he'd been telling himself. After we hung up, I spent the morning reading through the comments on my latest video. The responses were more nuanced than I'd expected. Many people shared their own stories of discovering difficult truths about their parents or grandparents. Others talked about the complexity of protecting children from information they weren't ready to handle. But what struck me most were the comments from mental health professionals and domestic violence advocates. They understood why I had hidden Giancarlo's diagnosis and history of violence. They recognized the impossible position I'd been in as a single mother, trying to protect my child, while also helping him maintain some positive connection to his father's memory. One comment in particular stayed with me. This is what protection looks like when you're a mother. Not perfect, not always wise, but always coming from love. Around noon, Jasper appeared at my back door with groceries and a concerned expression. Thought you might not want to brave the media circus out front, he said, setting bags on my kitchen counter. Plus, I figured you probably haven't been eating much. He was right. I'd been living on coffee and nervous energy for days. As he unpacked soup and bread and fresh fruit, I told him about my conversation with Bram, about the private investigator's report he'd commissioned, about the psychiatric records and police reports I'd thought would remain buried forever. How do you feel about him knowing the truth? Jasper asked as he heated soup on my stove. Terrified, I admitted, but also relieved. Do you know how exhausting it is to carry someone else's secrets for 30 years? To always be careful about what you say, what you reveal, what questions you answer honestly? I can imagine. But you did it because you loved him. I did it because I thought it was the right thing to do. But maybe there's a difference between protecting someone and controlling their access to truth. We ate lunch while watching the news coverage of our story unfold on my laptop. It was surreal seeing my face on CNN, hearing anchors debate whether I was a protective mother or a manipulative woman seeking revenge against her successful son. You know what bothers me most about all this? I said as we watched a panel of experts discuss our family dynamics. The way they're treating this like entertainment. Like our pain and our secrets and our complicated relationship is just content for them to consume. That's the world your son chose to enter, Jasper pointed out. The world where personal trauma becomes public property. But I never chose it. Until a week ago, I was just a retired art history professor, living quietly by the marsh. Now I'm a character in a story that's being told and retold by people who've never met me. That afternoon, I decided to visit someone I hadn't seen in years. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the therapist who had helped me navigate the aftermath of Giancarlo's abandonment in the 1990s. She was in her 70s now, semi-retired but still seeing a few long-term clients. Her office hadn't changed much. The same comfortable chairs, the same soft lighting, the same sense of being in a space designed for difficult conversations. "I've been following the news," she said after we'd exchanged pleasantries. "How are you holding up?" "I'm not sure. A week ago, I thought the hardest part of my life was behind me. Now I feel like I'm living through it all again, but this time in public." "Tell me about your decision to respond to Bram's video." I explained, my thinking, my anger at being mischaracterized, my sense that silence would be interpreted as admission of guilt. "But now I'm wondering if I made things worse," I concluded. "If I should have just ignored it and hoped it would fade away." Dr. Vasquez was quiet for a moment, the way she used to be when I was trying to work through particularly difficult realizations. "Do you remember what we talked about when you first came to see me?" she asked finally. "About the difference between secrecy and privacy?" I did remember. She had helped me understand that keeping Giancarlo's mental illness and history of violence private to protect Bram was different from keeping those facts secret to protect myself from blame or judgment. "You said that privacy serves the person being protected, while secrecy often serves the person doing the protecting. And do you think your decision to keep Giancarlo's history private served Bram, or served you?" "Both, I suppose. It protected him from knowledge that would have been painful and frightening as a child, but it also protected me from having to explain why I hadn't left sooner, why I hadn't seen the warning signs, why I had chosen to have a child with someone who was so unstable. And now he's an adult with children of his own, and keeping those secrets is serving no one. It's allowing him to build his identity and his career on a false understanding of his childhood, and it's allowing him to blame me for things that weren't actually my fault." Dr. Vasquez nodded slowly. "So what do you want to do now?" "I want to tell the whole truth, not just about Giancarlo's other family, but about his illness, his violence, his instability. I want Bram to understand why I made the choices I made, and I want his audience to understand that healing from family trauma isn't always about forgiveness and moving on. Sometimes it's about getting accurate information about what actually happened." "That's a significant decision, Eugenia. Once you share that information publicly, you can't control how it's used or interpreted." "I know, but I'm tired of being careful. I'm tired of protecting people who aren't protecting me in return." When I got home that evening, there was a package waiting on my doorstep. Inside was a manila envelope with no return address. The contents made my blood run cold. Copies of the medical records Bram had mentioned, Giancarlo's psychiatric evaluations and hospital admission forms, documentation of a mental illness that had been far more severe than I'd even known at the time. There was also a note written in Bram's handwriting. "I thought you should see what I found. We need to decide together how much of the truth we're willing to tell." For the first time since this whole ordeal began, my son was asking to work with me, rather than against me. But looking at those medical records, I wondered if there was such a thing as too much truth, and whether some secrets were meant to stay, buried forever. The medical records Bram had sent me painted a picture of his father that was even more complex and troubling than I had remembered. Giancarlo's psychiatric history included not just bipolar disorder, but episodes of paranoid delusions, substance abuse, and what one doctor had termed manipulative and potentially dangerous behavior toward intimate partners. But it was the letter tucked between the medical reports that made my hands shake as I read it. It was addressed to Linda Hoffman and dated September 15th, 1992, exactly 1 week before Giancarlo had left Bram and me. "My darling Linda," it began in Giancarlo's familiar handwriting, "I can't continue this charade any longer. Living with Eugenia has become impossible. She's suspicious, controlling, and I think she may be starting to suspect about us. The boy is the only good thing to come from that mistake of a marriage. But even he reminds me daily of how trapped I am." I had to stop reading and pour myself a glass of wine before I could continue. I know I promised I would leave her years ago, but the guilt about abandoning Bram kept me paralyzed. Now I realize that staying is hurting all of us. Eugenia deserves a husband who actually loves her, and I deserve to be with the woman who truly understands me. I'm going to tell her next week that I need space to find myself as an artist. It's kinder than the truth, and it will allow her to maintain some dignity. The letter went on for 3 pages, detailing Giancarlo's plan to gradually distance himself from Bram and me while rebuilding his life with Linda and their children. He wrote about feeling guilty for the deception, but justified it as necessary. For everyone's happiness, he described me as a good woman, but wrong for me, and Bram as intelligent but too much like his mother for my comfort. The cruelest part was his discussion of finances. "I'll send some money for the boys' expenses, but I can't continue supporting 2 households indefinitely. Eugenia is resourceful. She'll figure out how to manage on her own." Resourceful, as if raising a child alone while working multiple jobs was just a matter of being clever rather than a grinding, exhausting sacrifice that had defined the next 20 years of my life. But what devastated me most was the final paragraph. "I'm not proud of how I'm handling this, but I've learned that sometimes you have to choose between being honest and being kind. I'd rather let Eugenia believe I left to pursue my art than force her to confront the truth that I never really loved her the way she loved me." I sat in my living room with that letter in my lap and cried for the first time since this whole ordeal began. Not just for myself, but for the naive young woman I had been, the one who had believed her husband when he said he needed space, the one who had spent decades wondering what she had done wrong to drive him away. I had done nothing wrong. Giancarlo had simply chosen his other life over ours, then crafted a narrative that would allow him to feel noble about his betrayal. My phone rang while I was still processing the letter. It was Bram, calling from what sounded like his car. "Did you read everything?" he asked without preamble. "I'm still reading." "Bram, where did you get that letter?" "Linda Hoffman kept it. When my investigator contacted her, she agreed to meet with me. She's been carrying guilt about the whole situation for 30 years. Apparently, Dad told her you knew about them, that you were okay with the arrangement because you were focused on your career." Another lie. Another layer of deception that had allowed Giancarlo to maintain his relationships with both families without having to confront the harm he was causing. "She wants to talk to you," Bram continued. "She says she has things she needs to apologize for, mistakes she needs to acknowledge. I wasn't sure I was ready for that conversation, but I found myself curious about the woman who had shared my husband for so many years without my knowledge. There's something else, Mom. Something I need to tell you before we decide how much of this to make public. I waited, wondering what other secrets were about to be revealed. I think Dad might still be alive. The words hit me like a physical blow. For 30 years, I had assumed Giancarlo was dead. Not because anyone had told me so, but because he had simply vanished so completely from our lives. No birthday cards. For Bram, no attempts at contact, no trace of him anywhere. What do you mean you think he's alive? Linda lost touch with him about 15 years ago. He started having more frequent episodes, became increasingly paranoid and difficult to manage. Eventually, he just left her too, the same way he left us. But she hired investigators over the years, trying to find him because of child support issues. The last confirmed sighting was in 2018 in Arizona. He was living in a veterans shelter under a slightly different name. I tried to process this information. The man who had haunted my memories for 3 decades, the absent father who had shaped Bram's entire understanding of himself, might be alive and living as a homeless veteran in the desert. Do you want to find him? I asked. I don't know. Part of me does. But part of me thinks it might be better to leave the past alone. What about you? I don't know either. For so long, I've thought of him as a closed chapter. But if he's alive... We talked for another hour, trying to sort through the implications of this revelation. If Giancarlo was alive and we found him, would he want contact with Bram? Would he be mentally stable enough for such contact, to be healthy? And what would it mean for Bram's public narrative if his absent father turned out to be a mentally ill, homeless veteran rather than the artistic free spirit he had imagined? I've been thinking about what you said, Bram told me as our conversation wound down. About my brand being built on incomplete information. And you're right. But I don't know how to fix it without destroying everything I've worked for. Maybe some things need to be destroyed before they can be rebuilt properly, I said. Easy for you to say. You don't have employees depending on your income, speaking contracts worth millions of dollars, a book deal that requires me to maintain my credibility as a trauma expert. No, I just have a reputation and a sense of integrity that I've spent 70 years building, and maybe those things matter too. We agreed to meet in person the following weekend. Bram would fly to Boston, and we would drive together to meet Linda Hoffman in Hartford. It would be the first time in years that we'd spent more than a few hours together, and I wasn't sure how it would go. But first, I had a decision to make about the letter and the medical records. They painted a complete picture of why my marriage had failed, and why I had made the choices I had made as a single mother. They would vindicate me in the eyes of Bram's audience and probably earn me significant sympathy. But they would also expose Giancarlo's mental illness to public scrutiny, potentially making it harder for him to maintain housing or employment if he was indeed still alive. They would reveal Linda Hoffman's role in my marriage's destruction, possibly subjecting her to the same kind of online harassment I had been experiencing. And they would force Bram to confront not just the lies he had told about me, but the fundamental instability of the man he had spent his life trying to understand and forgive. That evening, I called Dr. Vasquez again. I have all the information now, I told her. Everything that was hidden. Everything that explains why things happened the way they did. But I'm not sure using it publicly is the right thing to do. What feels like the right thing to do? Honestly, part of me wants to burn it all and go back to my quiet life. But another part of me thinks this information could help people understand the complexity of family trauma in a way that Bram's simplified narrative never could. And what about Bram? What does he want? I think he wants to find a way to incorporate this information into his story without admitting that his original story was fundamentally flawed. But I don't think you can have it both ways. We talked for another half hour, exploring the ethical implications of making private medical information public, even when that information would serve my interests. You know, Dr. Vasquez said finally, there's a third option. You could share the information privately with the people who need to understand it. Bram, his team, maybe a few trusted friends, without making it part of the public narrative. But then how do I clear my name? How do I help people understand that I wasn't the villain in Bram's story? Maybe you don't need to clear your name with strangers on the internet. Maybe you just need to clear it with the people who actually matter to you. That night, I made my decision. I would share the letter and medical records with Bram, and together we would decide how to move forward. But I wouldn't post them online, wouldn't use them as weapons in our public battle. Because the truth was, I didn't want to be the kind of person who destroyed others to save herself, even when those others had tried to destroy me first. Some truths were too important to be turned into content, but some truths were also too important to remain hidden forever. Bram arrived on a gray Saturday morning in November, pulling into my driveway in a rental car with Massachusetts plates. I watched from my kitchen window as he sat behind the wheel for several minutes, apparently gathering his courage before getting out. He looked older than he did in his videos. There were lines around his eyes that careful lighting and camera angles had hidden, and his hair was starting to recede in a way that his styling had disguised. But he was still recognizably my son, still carrying himself with the careful posture of someone accustomed to being watched and evaluated. I opened the door before he could knock. "Hi, Mom," he said, and his voice was smaller than I'd heard it in years. "Hi, sweetheart." We stood there for a moment, looking at each other across a week that had changed everything between us. Then he stepped forward and hugged me, and I was surprised by how tightly he held on. "I'm sorry," he whispered into my shoulder. "I'm sorry for all of it." We spent the first hour just talking, trying to find our way back to a relationship that felt more like mother and son and less like adversaries in a public relations war. Bram told me about the pressure he'd been under since his video went viral, the way his team had been urging him to double down on his original narrative rather than admit any uncertainty. Celine keeps saying that showing vulnerability is good for my brand, but showing actual wrongness is career suicide, he said as we sat in my living room with coffee and the photo albums I'd pulled out for his visit. She wants me to frame this whole thing as a journey toward deeper understanding rather than an admission that I was factually incorrect about major parts of my childhood. "And what do you want?" I asked. "I want to tell the truth, but I'm not sure I can afford to." It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in years. We spent the afternoon going through boxes of his childhood memorabilia, report cards, art projects, letters he'd written me from summer camp. I watched him rediscover evidence of the childhood he'd described so differently to his audience. Photos of birthday parties I'd organized, certificates from activities I'd supported, thank you notes he'd written after family vacations I'd saved, for months to afford. "I remember this differently," he said, holding up a Father's Day card he'd made me when he was 10. Inside, in careful child's handwriting, it said, "Thank you for being my mom and my dad. You worked so hard to take care of me, and I love you." "How do you remember it?" I asked. I remember feeling like I had to take care of your emotions. Like I couldn't be sad about Dad leaving because it would make you sadder. Like I had to be grateful for everything you did. Because you were sacrificing so much for me. I sat with that for a moment, recognizing the truth in it, even as it hurt to hear. You probably did feel that way sometimes, I said finally. And I'm sorry for that. I was trying so hard not to burden you with my own grief and fear that I probably made you feel responsible for managing my feelings. But you were also just trying to hold everything together. I can see that now, looking at all this. He gestured to the evidence of our life spread across my coffee table. You were 29 years old, with an 8-year-old kid, and no support system. You did an incredible job under impossible circumstances. I did my best, but my best wasn't always what you needed. No, but it was what you could give. And maybe that's enough. Around 4 o'clock, we drove to Hartford to meet Linda Hoffman. The drive took 2 hours, and we spent most of it talking about Giancarlo. Not the mythical figure Bram had constructed in his imagination, but the real man we were both starting to understand. Did you ever suspect? Bram asked as we crossed into Connecticut. About his other family. Not at first, but toward the end, yes. He was gone so much, and when he was home he seemed elsewhere. Like he was performing the role of husband and father, rather than actually being those things. Why didn't you confront him? I was afraid of what I'd find out, and I was afraid of what would happen to us if my suspicions were confirmed. By the time I hired the investigator, he was already gone. Linda lived in a tidy colonial in West Hartford, not far from the house where Giancarlo had once maintained his double life. She was in her 70s now, with silver hair and kind eyes that reminded me of my own mother. She greeted us both with nervous warmth, clearly as unsure about this meeting as we were. Her living room was filled with photographs of her children and grandchildren, the family Giancarlo had chosen over us. But she had also kept photos of Giancarlo himself, and seeing his face after 30 years was jarring. He looked happy in those pictures, relaxed in a way I barely remembered from our marriage. I need you to know, Linda said as we settled into her comfortable chairs, that I didn't know about you for the first 2 years. Giancarlo told me he was divorced, that he had a son he saw occasionally, but that the relationship with his ex-wife was too toxic for regular contact. When did you find out the truth? I asked. When Sophia was 8 and she asked why she'd never met her half-brother. I started asking questions, and eventually Giancarlo admitted that he was still married to you. He said he'd been trying to leave for years, but that you kept threatening to take Bram away, if he did. Another lie. I had never threatened to withhold Bram from his father. I had simply expected Giancarlo to be honest about where he went and who he saw during his frequent absences. I should have ended things then, Linda continued. But I was in love, and I believed him when he said he was working on leaving you. He made you sound so difficult, so demanding and unstable. What changed? Bram asked. He started having more episodes. The paranoia got worse, and he became convinced that you were plotting against him, Eugenia. He thought you were having him followed, that you were trying to have him committed. When he finally left you, he was actually running from delusions as much as he was choosing us. The conversation continued for 2 hours, with Linda filling in gaps in our understanding of Giancarlo's mental state during those final years of our marriage. She showed us letters he'd written during his psychiatric hospitalizations, describing elaborate conspiracy theories involving me, his doctors, and various government agencies. I kept hoping he'd get better, she said. But the illness just got worse over time. Eventually, I had to choose between protecting my children and supporting him. I chose my children. Do you know where he is now? I asked. The last I heard, he was in a facility in Phoenix. But that was 3 years ago. He might have moved on by then. He never stayed anywhere for very long. As we prepared to leave, Linda handed Bram a shoebox similar to the one I'd kept hidden, in my closet. "These are letters he wrote you over the years," she said. "He never sent them, but he wrote them. I thought you should have them." The drive home was quieter, both of us processing what we'd learned. Bram read some of the letters by the light of his phone, occasionally sharing passages that revealed his father's ongoing struggle with mental illness and his guilt about abandoning his son. "He did love you," I said when Bram finished reading, a particularly heartbreaking letter from 2005. "He was just too sick to know how to show it in a healthy way. I think I understand now why you kept all this from me," Bram said. "If I'd known as a child that my father was severely mentally ill, that he'd been violent with you, that he'd abandoned me for delusions rather than for art, it would have destroyed me. But you're not a child anymore, and keeping those secrets has cost us both too much." When we got back to my house, Bram set up his phone to record us. "What are you doing?" I asked. "I want to have an honest conversation with you about all of this, and I want to record it. Not for my audience, necessarily, but for us. So we have a record of what we actually said to each other, how we actually feel, without the filter of time or memory." For the next 3 hours, we talked more honestly than we had in decades, about his childhood, about my choices, about the ways we'd both been shaped by Giancarlo's illness and abandonment, about the mistakes I'd made as a mother, and the unfair burden I'd placed on Bram to be my emotional support, about his resentment at feeling responsible for my happiness, and his guilt at resenting me for sacrifices I'd made for his benefit. But we also talked about love, the imperfect, complicated, sometimes painful love that had bound us together even when we couldn't understand each other. "I want to share this," Bram said when we finished recording. "Not the whole thing, but parts of it. I want my audience to see what it looks like when families actually work through their dysfunction instead of just performing their trauma for public consumption. Even if it means admitting you were wrong about me. Especially because it means admitting I was wrong about you. I've been selling people a story about healing that skips over the hardest part, taking responsibility for the harm you've caused while still acknowledging the harm that was done to you." That night, as Bram slept in his childhood bedroom, I lay awake thinking about forgiveness. Not the kind of forgiveness that Bram preached to his millions of followers. The clean, simple forgiveness that allowed people to move on and live their best lives. But the messy, complicated forgiveness that happens between real people who have really hurt each other. I forgave my son for the lies he'd told about me. But I also forgave myself for the ways I'd failed him as a mother. I forgave Giancarlo for the chaos he'd brought into our lives, while also acknowledging that forgiveness didn't erase the consequences of his choices. And I forgave the young woman I'd been, the one who had done her best, with impossible circumstances and imperfect information. In the morning, Bram and I made pancakes together, something we hadn't done since he was a teenager. As we cooked, he told me about his plans to step back from his current brand, to work with therapists and family counselors, to develop content that was more honest about the complexity of family relationships. It might mean losing followers, he said as he flipped pancakes with the same concentration he'd brought to everything as a child. It might mean making less money. But I can't keep building my success on oversimplified stories about good guys And bad guys? What about Selene? Your team? I'll figure it out. Maybe I need a different kind of team. People who care more about truth than engagement metrics. Before he left that afternoon, Bram hugged me again. I love you, Mom, he said. I've always loved you, even when I was angry at you. Even when I was blaming you for things that weren't your fault. I hope you know that. I do know that, I said. And I hope you know that everything I did, even the things that hurt you, came from love too. As I watched him drive away, I realized that this was what healing actually looked like. Not a clean narrative with clear heroes and villains, but a messy process of acknowledging complexity, taking responsibility, and choosing to love each other, despite our imperfections. It wasn't the kind of story that would go viral or sell millions of books, but it was true. 6 months later, I was tending my garden when Orla Dunn's podcast about our story was released. The episode, titled The Mother Who Fought Back, had been in production for months, incorporating interviews with me, Bram, Linda Hoffman, and several experts on family trauma and social media culture. I listened to it while pulling weeds from my vegetable patch, struck by how different our story sounded when told by someone who understood that there were no simple villains or heroes, only complicated people trying to navigate impossible circumstances. Orla had done something remarkable. She'd used our family's dysfunction to illuminate larger questions about truth, storytelling, and the commodification of personal trauma. She'd interviewed other children of social media influencers, other mothers who'd been publicly maligned by their adult children, other families who'd been torn apart by the pressure to perform their relationships for public consumption. What the Varelli case reveals, Orla concluded in her closing segment, is that healing is not content. Real family reconciliation is messy, private, and often boring. It doesn't provide clear takeaways or inspire viral videos, but it does something more important. It allows people to see each other as fully human rather than as characters in each other's stories. The podcast had been downloaded over 2 million times in its first week, spawning countless think pieces about digital storytelling and family privacy. But what mattered most to me was the text I received from Bram 20 minutes after it aired. Thank you for doing this the right way. Our relationship wasn't perfect now. It probably never would be, but it was honest in a way it hadn't been for years. We talked regularly, not about business or brand management, but about books we were reading, recipes we'd tried, memories we were re-examining in light of our new understanding. Bram had made good on his promise to change his approach to content. He'd taken a 3-month break from social media, worked with a team of therapists and ethical consultants, and returned with a completely different kind of message. Instead of offering simple solutions to complex problems, he now talked about the importance of sitting with discomfort, of accepting that some questions don't have clean answers. His follower count had dropped by about 30%, but his engagement had actually increased. People were hungry for authentic conversations about family complexity, it turned out. They were tired of being sold these simplistic narratives about overcoming trauma. I'm learning that there's a difference between being vulnerable and being honest, he'd said in his first video back. Vulnerability can be performed, but honesty requires you to risk everything you think you know about yourself. He'd never explicitly apologized for his original characterization of me. His legal team had advised against it. But he'd spent months gently correcting the record, sharing memories that complicated his original narrative, talking about the ways children's perspectives on their parents evolve as they mature. More importantly, he'd started being honest about his own parenting struggles. He talked about the pressure of raising children in the public eye, about his fear of repeating his own family's patterns, about the challenge of being present for Mara and Anouk while managing a career built on sharing personal information. I'm realizing that my daughters deserve to have their childhoods belong to them, not to my content calendar. He'd said in one particularly powerful video. They deserve the privacy to make mistakes and grow and figure out who they are without worrying about how their stories will be packaged for public consumption. The girls had started visiting me more regularly. Bram brought them east every few months now, and we'd spend long weekends walking on the beach, building sandcastles and creating the kind of unhurried memories that couldn't be monetized or turned into teachable moments. Mara, who was 8 now, and looked remarkably like Bram had at that age, had taken to calling our visits Nonna time, and insisted that no phones or cameras be present during our adventures. Anouk, more extroverted and performative than her sister, sometimes forgot about the no-phone rule but quickly self-corrected when reminded. I like that you don't take pictures of everything we do, Mara had told me during their last visit. It makes it feel more real. Children, I was learning, understood the difference between living and performing better than most adults. I had settled into a quieter rhythm myself. The media attention had faded, though I still occasionally received interview requests from people researching family dynamics or social media culture. I'd become more selective about which stories I chose to participate in, preferring conversations that emphasized complexity over sensationalism. My own small social media presence had evolved too. Instead of responding to Bram's content, I'd started sharing my watercolor paintings of the marsh, my recipes for the vegetables I grew in my garden, my observations about the changing seasons in Ashgrove. Nothing profound or viral-worthy, just the gentle documentation of a life being lived rather than performed. But I'd also started something new, a small private workshop for other mothers who'd been publicly maligned by their adult children. We met once a month in my living room, sharing our stories and supporting each other through the complex process of defending ourselves while still loving the children who'd hurt us. The thing about being a mother, said Margaret, whose daughter had written a best-selling memoir about growing up with an emotionally absent parent, is that you never stop hoping for reconciliation, even when your children have made their grievances public property. But you also can't wait forever for them to see you clearly, added Rose, whose son's YouTube channel featured regular rants about his narcissistic upbringing. At some point, you have to decide to live your own truth, whether they understand it or not. These women had taught me that my experience with Bram wasn't unique. There was an entire generation of adult children who'd learned to process their family relationships through the lens of pop psychology and social media performance, often at the expense of nuance and empathy. But there was also a growing counter-movement of people who were tired of simplified narratives about family dysfunction, therapists who specialized in complex family systems, adult children who were beginning to question their own grievance narratives, parents who were learning to set boundaries around how their stories could be shared publicly. Change was happening, slowly and imperfectly, but it was happening. In July, I received an unexpected visitor, Linda Hoffman, who had driven up from Hartford to spend the day with me. We'd stayed in touch since our meeting with Bram, finding comfort in our shared experience of loving the same complicated man. "I've been thinking about forgiveness," she said as we sat on my back porch watching the marsh grass sway in the summer breeze. "Not forgiving Giancarlo. I did that years ago. But forgiving myself for the choices I made, the secrets I kept, the ways I enabled his deception." "What would that look like?" I asked. I think it looks like accepting that I did the best I could with the information I had at the time, and understanding that the best I could do wasn't always good enough, but it was still the best I could do. We spent the afternoon going through photo albums, sharing memories of the man who had shaped both our lives in such different ways. Linda showed me pictures of Giancarlo with his other children, Sophia, who was now a teacher in Vermont, and Michael, who worked as a social worker in Boston. "They've both struggled with his abandonment, too," she said. "Sophia spent years in therapy, trying to understand why he left. Michael became a social worker partly because he wanted to help other children whose parents couldn't take care of them properly. Do they know about Bram? They do now. After everything became public, I told them the whole truth. Sophia wants to meet him someday, when he's ready. She says she's always wondered about her half-brother." The possibility of Bram connecting with his half-siblings felt both hopeful and complicated. Another layer of family relationships to navigate. More opportunities for healing or for hurt. But that was the reality of family. It was never as simple as you wanted it to be. Never as clean as the stories you told about it. As autumn approached, I found myself thinking about legacy. Not the kind of legacy that gets measured in social media followers or book sales, but the quieter legacy of lessons learned and wisdom shared. I had spent the first 70 years of my life trying to protect others from difficult truths. Now I was learning to trust that people, even people I loved deeply, could handle more complexity than I'd given them credit for. Bram called on a crisp October evening, the kind of night when the air carries the promise of winter and the satisfaction of a year well lived. "I've been thinking about Dad," he said without preamble, "about whether we should try to find him." "Have you decided what you want to do?" "I think I want to know if he's alive. I don't necessarily want a relationship with him, but I want to know whether the story of our family is finished, or if there are still chapters to be written." "That makes sense. Would you want to be involved? If we do find him, would you want to see him again?" I considered the question seriously. Did I want to see the man who had shaped so much of my life through his absence? Did I want to confront the person whose choices had forced me to become someone I'd never expected to be? "I think I would," I said finally. Not because I need closure, or forgiveness, or any of those therapy words, but because I'm curious about who he became after he left us, and because I think I'm strong enough now to see him clearly, without all the anger and hurt that used to cloud my vision. We made plans to hire another investigator, to begin the process of searching for a man who might not want to be found. It felt like the right next step in a story that had already surprised us both with its capacity for healing and growth. After we hung up, I walked out to my garden, where the last tomatoes of the season hung heavy on their vines. The marsh beyond was settling into its evening quiet, the only sounds the gentle lap of water against the shore and the distant call of night birds. I picked tomatoes by the light of my porch lamp, filling a basket with the fruits of a summer's patient tending. Tomorrow I would make sauce, preserving the harvest for the months ahead. It struck me that this was what I had always been doing, taking what the season offered, transforming it into something that could sustain us through harder times, trusting that careful attention and patient care would yield something nourishing. I had raised a son, weathered a marriage's dissolution, survived public humiliation, and found my way back to something that felt like peace. Not perfect peace. That was a myth sold by people like my son used to be. But the kind of peace that comes from accepting complexity and choosing love anyway. The memory box I had started keeping sat on my kitchen table, filled with items that, represented this strange year of reckoning and reconciliation. A photo from Bram's latest visit, showing us laughing over a board game with his daughters. A letter from one of the mothers in my support group, thanking me for helping her find her voice. A pressed flower from Linda's garden, given to me as a token of unexpected friendship. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper, was the engagement ring Giancarlo had given me in 1982. I had finally removed it from my jewelry box, where it had sat for 30 years, and placed it in this collection of memories. Not because I had forgiven him. Forgiveness suggested a debt that needed to be cancelled, and I no longer saw our relationship in terms of debts and payments. But because I had finally integrated his role in my story without letting it define the entire narrative, he had been my husband. He had been Bram's father. He had been a man struggling with an illness that made him incapable of the kind of love we had needed from him. All of those things were true, simultaneously, and none of them were the whole truth. The whole truth, I had learned, was always larger and more generous than any individual perspective could contain. As I carried my basket of tomatoes inside, I thought about the story I would tell if someone asked me to summarize this year. It wouldn't be a story about good guys and bad guys, about justice served or wrongs righted. It would be a story about the courage to sit with complexity, the strength to love imperfectly, and the wisdom to keep growing even when growing hurts. It would be a story worth living, even if it never went viral. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.